Hello and welcome everyone to this session. I am very, very honored to be the active moderator with this amazing panel. I'll just start quickly by introducing myself. My name is Yvette Loynaz. I am the Director of Artistic Administration at Opera Theater of St. Louis, a Miami native, and I am zooming in from St. Louis, Missouri, the lands of the Illinois Confederacy, the Osage Nation, and the Missouri people. For those in the audience, I am a fair-skinned Latina with short brown hair and wearing a blue and navy white blouse. And I will now like to invite my amazing panel to introduce themselves. And I would like to start with Harold.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you today. Again, my name is Harold Brown. I am the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, located in Southwest Ohio. In terms of our land acknowledgement, the Cincinnati area was first occupied by the Adena and Hopewell cultures, and then later the Miami, Shawnee, and Osage peoples. I am an African-American male. I'm wearing a gray striped sports coat and a blue shirt. And again, I'm honored to be here with you today.
Thank you, Harold. Jenny.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and congratulations to the Sphinx organization for another opportunity to pull us all together. I'm Jenny Bilfield. I'm President and CEO of Washington Performing Arts in Washington, D.C., and thrilled to be here with colleagues, including one of my board members, Kerrien Suarez. I am a native New Yorker. I am a white woman with brown hair wearing a black leather vest with a green striped shirt and lots of earrings. And I am delighted to join you from our nation's capital, but truly with humility and growing awareness, I acknowledge the Anacostan and Piscataway people who inhabited and cultivated this land before the European takeover and settlement of the land and the virtual displacement of the local American Indians. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Jenny. Rick.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rick Sperling. I am calling in, zooming in, however we are in, from Ann Arbor, Michigan, my home in Ann Arbor, from the native lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot. I am a middle-aged white Jewish male with a prematurely gray beard. I am the founder and artistic director emeritus of Mosaic Youth Theater of Detroit. You got to see our current executive director in an earlier session. And I am currently a full-time consultant with the Detroit Public Schools and am launching a collective impact initiative called Detroit Excellence in Youth Arts.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And Kerrien.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation to join today. I'm Kerrien Suarez. I'm president of Equity in the Center. I'm joining from the Washington, D.C. area, like Jenny, on the unceded lands of the Piscataway tribe. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm also a proud board member of Washington Performing Arts, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, did you have, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't do my description. I'm a Black woman, brown skin, curly hair, wearing a black tunic with polka dots.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we are here to talk about making room and doing right and exploring ways in which allies and leaders everywhere can generate impact by centering others. So I wanted to start us off by really just talking about what does inclusion and centering others look like, particularly from an ally and leadership perspective. Rick, would you like to kick us off and give us some thoughts?
Sure. And first of all, I want to start by saying that this is a process. I have been working through this for about 30 years and more intensely the last couple of years as someone who founded an organization that served predominantly African-American youth in Detroit. It's always been the focus to center the youth of Detroit. In the last couple of years, last 4 years actually, it became clear that centering others means changing my role in some ways. I retired from Mosaic Youth Theater of Detroit and was able to have a alumni of our program, DeLachey Strotter, step up and take the baton and lead the organization. And I've been working more behind the scenes at Detroit Public Schools, and then hopefully developing this large collective impact initiative. So one of the things, that I think has always been a challenge for me is that centering others is a direct challenge to kind of the traditional thoughts we have of leadership. The leadership that is about the great man or woman, the pioneer, the person whose energy and action is able to make something happen. And what I've learned over the years and what I'm still working on is how does that traditional model get in the way of centering others? And so it really is calling for leading by listening, leading by making space, leading by providing a platform for others. And I think that is the challenge, especially for a lot of people who are, doing dynamic work. We were traditionally rewarded by going out and getting and leading in a very leading from the front, and that is a real challenge. But I think one of the things that is important, the other part of this this title is doing good, is that I don't think the answer is to not take action. I don't think that the answer is not to use the influence and power that you've developed, but to use it for good, which means that providing a platform for others, providing support for others, and letting others lead the what in the work you're doing, while you might continue to be able to use what you have been able to develop and the privilege you have to help with the how, to help with making things happen. And so I still think that your influence or the things that you've developed are still of great value, but it has to be, to really center others, you have to look at leadership in a different way. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great, Rick. I mean, I think I hear also a little bit in just the redefining of leadership, also thinking about that power shift or like a new way of exercising your power, and how leaders need to also kind of acknowledge what that feels like to lose power, because we are also trained and educated to think that leaders have to exercise a certain amount of power. Do any of the other panelists want to talk about this power shift and how you really do empower others in that centering work?
I can share a couple of thoughts if that's helpful. Power hoarding is a characteristic of white dominant culture. And so a lot of what we're talking about is the traditional definition of leadership that is white and male and rooted in business culture. And so what we're all trying to get away from by centering the lived experiences and the expertise, the lived expertise of those who've been traditionally underrepresented, or the folks who are not in the room, is we're trying to make progress toward equity. And part of that is dismantling white dominant culture or white supremacy and trying to actively replace it with a culture we've co-created that values all humans and leadership styles and the bodies they inhabit equally. So we each as individual leaders have a role to play in that by decentering ourselves, centering the lived experiences of folks of color, non-able-bodied folks, people who don't identify as straight or cis LGBTQIA folks. So centering those who've been traditionally excluded from systems of power. But institutions also have to commit to the organizational transformation that will mean white dominant culture, and that standard of leadership that we're trying to learn how to move away from is not the norm and the expectation and the bar against which we're all measured.
That's great. Thank you, Kerrien. This tees up the next question. Oh, sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
No, I was going to echo what both Kay and Rick have said and just add consistency of effort. This isn't something that's kind of a one and done effort, and it's every moment to practice how that centering is done from a governance perspective, from a programmatic perspective, from hiring, HR, right across the board. And that takes time and patience and a commitment to the discipline of always keeping the that notion of centering and platform creation and power sharing at the forefront.
Absolutely. And as we're thinking about this as a practice, and for organizations to do this work, Harold, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what is the impact of this practice and some of the challenges which we're talking about here, and some of the ways that we can dismantle and lead through governance?
Yeah, I mean, my role is in large part to develop as well as help lead the implementation of a pretty aggressive DE&I plan. And so I try to anticipate the challenges in the various conversations and in the work that I do. And so I always start with the vision. We've all agreed in our organization that we want to be the most relevant orchestra in America. And you can't talk about relevance without talking about inclusion and centering, because relevant to whom and in what ways means that we have to be able to relate to and provide value and be valued by every member of our community. And so for me, that's always a great starting point. It's hard to argue with that, right? And so when I talk to folks about this, whether internally or externally, they usually have three questions. One is, why is it important? The second is, and they may say this in two different ways. They may say, what do you want me to do? Or they may say, what can I do? Same question phrased very differently. And the third question is, what's it going to cost me? And a lot of times in that third question, they don't necessarily come out with that explicitly. It may be much more implicit, but I'm always trying to be prepared to answer those three questions, because ultimately we are asking folks who hold power and who hold influence and who have dominated our space to relinquish that and to open up to let others be part of it. And the only other thing I'd say is, for me, there's a lot of things that we could say around active listening and everything else, but it's just really important to invite folks in to be part of the solution building. So I don't know why it seems to be a new discovery in our civil discourse, but it is important. It's critically important to talk to and engage with the folks that you're trying to address or target, or folks who are affected by what it is you're trying to solve. And so for me, that's really, really critical. Let's bring into the house those folks that have the answers that we don't have, and help and cause them to be part of the problem solving.
Great. So as we got to know each other and kind of preparing for this, I would love to hear from your organizations and from your perspective, like how are some real examples of this in action? I think maybe Jenny or Rick, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I mean, I think when we spoke, I referenced a really profound experience that we had with our Children of the Gospel Choir. By way of introduction, Washington Performing Arts has had two gospel choirs for the past 30 years. And one of them is a youth choir of young people ages 9 to 18. It's by audition to get in, and the students receive vocal training and pedagogical training, and some become professional musicians, others don't, but they remain actively involved their whole lives. And in 2017-18, the directors, and notably Michelle Fallon, the artistic director, who actually Aaron Dworkin interviewed on Arts Engines a week ago, she was receiving a lot of feedback from the young people in the program that they wanted to craft the narrative for their final performance of our season, and to work with the music directors and the band and the teachers to really share thoughts about social justice, about their roles as youth, and many other musical talents and creative talents that they had. And so the whole year they were supported through the creation of this narrative. And one of the things they wanted to do was to really express this sort of sense of anger at the injustices that they were seeing around Colin Kaepernick taking the knee as a member, as a very visible and important sports figure. So for the performance, we engaged with Blacks in Wax, which is Cora Masters Barry's very unique and very important historical and cultural organization in Washington, D.C. that focuses on important figures in Black history. And she happened to have a young person who had been studying Colin Kaepernick and had memorized a monologue that had been written for him about his life and his work. And we asked the student, would you like to have this figure as part of the program? And they were super excited. So the program was put together. The students created the narrative. The program was beautiful. We had about, 800 or 900 people in the audience. And I had thought, should we include this moment in our advanced promotion? Should we let our board know, our audience know that this was a component of the program? And I thought, you know what? No, we're going to let this moment happen programmatically, and we're going to trust that the people who have come to this concert are going to understand and appreciate the sense of strength and vulnerability that the students are bringing to crafting their narrative. And it was set up in this way at the concert. But I stood in the back of the auditorium, and when this moment was coming, this young man walked onto the stage wearing a big afro and black leather jacket. And at the moment he finished delivering his monologue, he took a knee, and all of the members of the Children of the Gospel took a knee. And I held my breath because I thought, please let this be the audience that I think it is. It was a mixed audience, Black families, white families, people of all ages. And there was quiet, and then there was an eruption of applause. And I thought, okay, when you trust that things are done for the right reason and you step out of the way and provide a platform, experiences can surprise you and remind you to be brave. And, upon reflection, this is a good, 3.5, 4 years ago, the topic of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was still so fresh for so many people. And it was such an important and symbolic moment. I was so proud that the students had the courage to do this and to behave and perform the way they did. They were incredible examples and inspirations. So, I was also incredibly proud of our community of patrons and board, that there was never a question from anyone that this was a role that we could play in stepping forward. It was very true to our mission. And ultimately, the students felt this great confidence. This sort of co-creation of narrative was something that we sustained and have sustained since then. Every year, the students have a very strong voice in the message that they want to share with audiences each season. And in fact, our digital programs last year and the year before reflected their input and their poetry, their spoken word, their voice. And that's one of many examples, but it's one that for me was perhaps I felt the most vulnerable and protective, and yet really I wouldn't say validated, because it wasn't about me, but I felt that our organization could go even further and continue and to be inspired by the young people who stepped forward and the way we supported them. So I've gone on long enough. I'm sorry, but it was a very important experience for us, and one that I really treasure.
Yes, definitely. And for me, I think what I'm hearing, and this has now come up even across today's sessions, about like moving away from the self and really looking at community from every level, especially leadership. I think for myself, as someone who's in my current position for a year, and finding myself trying to find ways to center others, to empower others, and while at the same time balancing my own power and using my power for good. And so it's it's uncomfortable, I think, for those who've been sitting in power for a long time, and in this kind of dynamic of trying to bring others in. And I think just acknowledging that it's not just the work for new leaders or young people coming in and like speaking up and saying what they think, but it's also for those who are just accustomed to the systems that we're all trying to dismantle or rebuild, or I'm not sure like the right vocabulary for that, but we all have to think of it differently in every piece that we are within the organization. So I love that story, and I think that's the power in the decentering. If you really look at your work as lifting others up and bringing more people in, and doing this in community. So I thank you for that story, Jenny.
Yvette, can I?
Mhm.
Yes. So when you asked this question, the first thing that popped into my mind is something that we're really investing heavily in here with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. We're taking the orchestra out into the community. So we have institutionalized now a series of concerts in neighborhoods, and particularly in neighborhoods where the populations are underrepresented in classical music traditionally. So we've been able to get a significant amount of funding to basically endow a series of neighborhood and parks concerts around our city. So we recognize that lots of folks that we're trying to attract and trying to become relevant to are not going to come down to music hall, with all its formality and tradition. So we're trying to take the orchestra and our music out into the community, expose them to that, and work with them to design those programs so that they're relevant to the neighborhood, to occasions and celebrations that might be going on as well. So that's, to me, that's a very simple. It's much more difficult to do than it sounds, but to be able to go out into the community puts the community at the center, and we're their guests.
Yvette, may I add something?
Yes, please.
Just as I'm listening to Harold and then to Jenny's example, also what I'm hearing or remembering are things that come up when I facilitate conversations with classical music or performing arts organizations often, as well as all other organizations, honestly. But the challenge of tokenizing. So I think what's important to note about the example that Jenny gave and the example that Harold gave is that the Children of the Gospel Choir is not a Black History Month choir. It wasn't a response to the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter choir. It's been up and running for decades. It's the equivalent of a symphony that has a full season and they perform on the main stage. So if we're going to highlight voices that haven't been traditionally in the foreground or on the main stage in the performing arts or in classical music, you want to make sure that you're providing equity in the platform. So the children, as Jenny described it, were critical in producing and conceiving the event. Their voices were centered and they were presented on a main stage, and they have a full season's worth of performances. And I think in the experience or the example that Harold shared, what you would be going for as you look at your full season, for example, is that those concerts that are held in neighborhoods and in parks are valued by the organization as equal in value to those that are presented at Symphony Hall.
Absolutely.
And that you're not inviting people in to tokenize them or give them a seat at a table around which they'll never be equal. So it's just important to acknowledge that communities have power. Classical music and presenters have traditionally just ignored it and minimized it and engaged folks in a colonial way. So as we invite people in, it's just important to center equity in the manner in which we engage them. And I think those were two examples that highlight that.
If people didn't hear the New Horizons session earlier, I would recommend watching it on demand because it was really, really powerful about how the equity has to be not just in who is sitting in what seat, but the structure, the systemic way things work. And my successor, DeLachey Strada, blew me away during that session because they asked her, what's your vision? And she said, I don't have a vision. My vision is to amplify the voices of the young people in Mosaic. The idea that, back to that leadership thing, that it's not about the leader's vision as much as you have to change the system. And so while DeLachey is an African-American woman in that role, she's also changing the system in a way that's going to be different when she leaves, who's ever in that place. In Mosaic, another thing they talked about was sitting at tables. Who gets the seat at the table and what the tables are. And I think that's a lot. We're working on equity in Detroit through this DEYA, Detroit Excellence in Youth Arts Initiative. But the key is going to be that young people have to be at the table. And we have to create new tables that they lead. And it can't just be done for them. And it can't just be done with their advice. The people who are going to benefit, the people that have the greatest challenge, have to be the leaders, and we can support with the how and make it happen and provide a platform. But once again, the what has to change from the leader person. The what has to change to the people that are being centered. One really interesting thing we talked in the pre-show was about this new concept that I really love. It's not that new, but in terms of privilege, and that's the concept of Slack. Do you have Slack? So it's not, and Slack means access to, emotional and other resources, but I have an instinctive feeling of what Slack is. Because I know that there's a lot of places, as hard as I worked, that I was able to succeed because I had Slack. I had the ability to fail and pick myself back up. I had people that could make connections for me. And so if you look at, the goal is to create Slack for other people, to provide Slack for other people. That's an active thing that everybody can do, providing that Slack to be able to lead the work.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And thank you, audience members. I just want to invite you. Thank you for the questions that are coming in. And I want to invite you to keep sending those questions. I will definitely make my efforts to put them together where I can, or incorporate them into questions we already have. So really, thank you for bringing those in. Panelists, I want to share here an audience question at this time to make sure that we're getting some joint perspective here. So this question goes, whoever wants to speak up. Can you provide specific strategies for centering the voices of the community in programming? How do you go about having these conversations within the community? And I'll just add, maybe Harold, you can start us off because you got called out specifically to talk about how you're doing this in your organization.
Sure. Two examples, just building on the one that I had before, and I see the question. Our Director of Community Engagement works very diligently to connect with community councils and neighborhood leaders with regard to their interest in hosting either a concert or having us come and help them celebrate. It was the 125th anniversary of a certain neighborhood last year. So we did a pretty major concert for them in a park for their community to come together. So it's really about connecting with folks in that community to see what they want. And then also asking them, what music do they want to hear? Most of the time, they're just like, we just want you to come. We just want whatever you think is appropriate and best. And so it's really about reaching out and listening and then being willing to do that. And we've actually negotiated into our collective bargaining agreement with our musicians additional opportunities for the musicians to be able to go out and do that in ensembles or in full orchestra. So that's been a major priority for us. The other thing I would just mention quickly, we have a Multicultural Awareness Council, we call it the MAC, that's been in existence for over 30 years. And as I arrived on the scene last year, I think we had not really worked very well with them in recent years around improving. Their mission is to increase audience diversity as well as programming diversity. So we have worked very hard recently to make sure they are fully aware of our plans and our strategies and trying to bring them in to be part of the solutions. But we actually have drawn from our subscription series what we call our MAC series, where they contribute ideas for programming, whether it be artists, conductors, performers, etc. And then they take a subset of those and really bring it together as a series that they really promote and work and volunteer and amplify. We call it the MAC series. So again, as in our efforts to appeal to the broadest swaths of our community, not just the traditional audiences, and to diversify our programming, our performers, our repertoire, et cetera, using a community group that's very passionate about our organization and has been for many years to lead that and to weigh in on that is proving very, very helpful. And we only want to build that out even further.
Great. Here's another question that's going to tie us into one of our planned questions. So how is this work sustainable? All of these initiatives that we're talking about and how centering others, like how do you go about making sure that these efforts sustain, particularly with changes in leadership, in board, in, all of these, especially in these pandemic times where companies have had to shift quickly? Anyone want to, Jenny, would you like to jump in for this?
Sure. Actually, and just to add one thought about community, and we are evolving this at Washington Performing Arts too. When we describe community, it occurred to me a couple of years ago that community was being othered. Like there's this, and then there's the community. And so actually when we describe community, I will say our community of patrons, teachers, artists, students, blah, 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 because it is a wide community of people involved in the arts as opposed to these people and then the community, which, after a while, that nuance begins to sound a little bit like colonial. And I'm not saying that we've solved it, but I'm trying to evolve that notion of differentiation because people who participate in various ways, we're all part of that community. Anyway, to your question, one thing that was really apparent to me and with your question and just the topic in general is that there needs to be a seamlessness. This is not work that happens in one part of an organization. And at Washington Performing Arts, we looked at the complete sort of vertical integration of values from the level of governance, staffing, programming, programs in our school programs, how we appear on the website. And there's this constant sort of revisiting of how we engage practices of inclusion and transformation as an organization. The goal is that if you look at any part of our organization, either our junior board, our board of directors, women's committee, the programming, the concerts in schools, our Mars Arts DC initiative, which focuses on artists who live and work locally, that you will recognize the values of our organization, as opposed to seeing one thing if you look at the board and another thing if you look at our arts education programs. And that's been a moment of opportunity to look at where we may have missed or where we can do better to amplify. And connecting all of this to the historic values of our founder, Patrick Hayes, who coined the term everybody in, nobody out. It's easy to sort of say, oh, everybody in, nobody out. That's, built in, baked in. But how are we honoring those words? Are we doing it in every possible way? Where are we doing it? Where can we do better? So it's this sort of hypervigilance and ensuring that at any point of access, someone will meet a group of people in our organization and recognize that this is Washington Performing Arts. And it's been very intentional and at every level of the organization. And we keep cycling through it.
That's great. Kerrien, I would love for you to jump in on this because I know we talk a lot about diversity training, and everyone in this moment has really taken on like trying to build a plan or trying to do the things to get their staff either the education they need or their board the education they need. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you get this work from transactional to transformative?
Sure. Equity in the Center, we talk about organizations moving from awake to woke to work in terms of building a race equity culture, but the framework holds for intersectional equity, like not just centering race, but centering folks of all underrepresented identities. And a lot of what Jenny said reflects our overall approach, which is that you need to have an overall organization, institution-wide, cross-functional, from the board to the volunteers and interns plan to transform your culture, process, policy, and practice to the point where, as Jenny was highlighting, your dynamic for engaging the community is not colonial because the community is embedded in your organization. Presenters and foundations and symphonies and operas work desperately to engage communities because community is not inside of their institution. So if you're building what we call a race equity culture or an equity culture in an intersectional context, your staff, your board, your process, your practice, your policy, your education around how you sustain and center equity in the daily practice of your work, whether you play the trombone or you sing arias or you dance or you collect the tickets, in whatever way equity needs to be centered in your respective practice inside of an arts organization, that has been clearly articulated and supported from awareness to understanding to action inside of an organization. Some people may not like what I'm going to say, but diversity training does not work. That's actually what the data says. So we can go to a training, we can learn a skill, we can be aware that we need the skill or that we, for example, have implicit bias, and our practice never changes. It's the obligation of the institution to scaffold staff members' learning, and I'm going to include the board and all other stakeholders in that bucket of people whose learning need to be scaffolded, from awareness to understanding to action. And they need to be supported at each step of the way so that they understand how when I go to a training on microaggressions, or I go to a training on how identity-based disparities show up in our organizational data, I understand what that means for my individual role as a board member, as a CEO, as a VP, and so on. So it's having that robust plan and then securing the support externally through consultants and then internally with some in-house expertise to ensure that you can live the words that are in your equity statement in practice every single day, because that's where the rubber meets the road. Is we all at organizations have a lot of words about how much we value the community, how much we value equity, but there are still persistent experiences of inequity inside of our organizations every day. So I'll stop there.
Yes, Kay.
Actually, Yvette, can I just add a
Please,
part?
go ahead.
So Kay was a member of our junior board and actually worked with our team and worked with me to reinforce this approach and the work that she and Equity in the Center have done to document those different stages and the internalization of process is profoundly important. And I'm grateful for the way that she pushed us and has pushed the board, because she has actually had a transformative impact on the way we think about embedding that. So there is a real connection, and she has helped bring us miles.
Thank you.
And just one other quick anecdote. So, the leadership point cannot be overemphasized. I'm very fortunate that we have a CEO who unapologetically pursues DE&I and makes sure that it's something that we are constantly focused on. But if you were listening to the previous session, I think Marcia Sells from the Metropolitan Opera mentioned that she's the first to hold her position as Chief Diversity Officer and one of the first of a major legacy arts organization. I'm also the first to hold this position. We've never had this position before. But just in terms of being embedded, our CEO has been working this. We have a board member who's also a major donor who, for the first time in our history, has endowed an administrative position, not just a music position, but he has endowed my position. It's not about me. It's very humbling, obviously, but to ensure that there will always be a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer that reports to the CEO. To me, that's a big statement. It's a big, it makes a bold statement, again, from a wealthy white donor board member who sees the value in this and has stepped forward and said, this is important enough to put my money where my mouth is.
Yes.
One thing I would say about the sustainability is, once again, it's not enough just to have a person of color, an African-American person in the leadership role. The system has to change. The way things are done has to change, or it's not going to be sustainable. I really am pushing hard for this new leadership that's coming in to be paid well, to be supported in a significant way. One of the slack things, I think, is that a lot of us in the nonprofit world who come from a background of privilege have that slack to be able to work for less money than you should be able to work more hours than is healthy, to be able to just switch the race and gender of that person if it's not a sustainable position if it's not something that is going to be sustainable for that staff to be able to work and do this work, then it's not going to be sustainable. So I think we have to look at the arts and the nonprofit world in general in terms of, how these systems support the people doing the work.
I'd like to add to this also by saying one of the things that I feel strongly about, and I think, Kay, you brought this up in sharing some of your insights with me, is the accountability to the learning and the mindset of learning that leaders have to take on, because the responsibility of teaching and bringing awareness on these issues is not just on people of color. It's not just on young people. It's not just on new leaders. It really is on folks who've been sitting in particular positions of power and holding it for a really long time, to do their own learning, to take it on themselves and to ask questions, and to not expect, because you hire a new Black leader, Latinx, or whatever identity you don't have in your organization, that they are now going to be responsible for informing every EDI strategy and every EDI action you want to take. And I felt that was so powerful, Kay, when you said that to me, that how most leaders are not prepared for this adult learning. I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but that stayed with me.
Oh, no, thanks. So, yeah, first of all, as you say, it's not the responsibility of people of color to dismantle a system that oppresses them. It's not the responsibility of people who identify as queer to dismantle a system that oppresses folks who aren't straight and cisgender. So many of us, probably some of us in this Zoom or on this stream, have been the diversity in the room. So we're the person who was hired or brought into a space by virtue of their background, plus some other expertise, but you checked a box, and so there you are. And therefore, you are somehow an expert on dismantling structural oppression, or you should have an opinion on everything the organization is trying to do to engage the community or to work on diversity and inclusion. And I'm intentionally saying diversity and inclusion and not equity, because at that point it's transactional, it's window dressing. It is the responsibility of the people who are privileged by a system to dismantle a system. Now, you could be talking about, racial oppression, the patriarchy. I have privilege and have to be conscious of how I move within an organization and in spaces that I occupy, because I am very well positioned to uphold white supremacy by virtue of the power and the privilege that I have. So we as folks of color need to think about that. But to your point, Yvette, in organizations, it's the responsibility of white folks to dismantle a system that preferences them in partnership with and centering the lived experiences of people of color, operating in solidarity with them to dismantle the system that was designed to preference them. Even if I am a chief diversity officer, and I have been in an organization, had a role where I focus on equity, but not on that organization's internal equity, I'm within my rights to say, I will not do this for you as a Black woman. And I had that conversation. That's probably one of the most difficult professional conversations I have had. Yes, I have some expertise on equity. No, that is not my job here. And you will not use me in that way simply because I'm the Black woman in the room. And I keep saying things that no one else will say. It's your obligation to go out, secure the support of an external consultant, and to do the learning, and then push yourself to the application to change the institution. That's not my job. It's not any of our jobs for those of us who are from underrepresented groups. It's the responsibility of the institution. And we as board members, as staff members, have to hold the institution accountable to that.
Yes. Okay. And now, speaking of this talent and like bringing new people into spaces, I think one of the things that I think a lot of organizations think about in this last year of just like so much transition and what is now being coined the Great Resignation of 2021, and I can argue it may still be in that space. How do organizations, what would your advice be, panel, to those who have recently hired new leaders, particularly leaders of color, to keeping this talent and allowing this talent to influence this space? Who'd like to take that one? Jenny.
Commit to a budget for a coach. I mean, I think this is important for anyone making a leadership transition. Leadership, especially CEO level leadership, is really lonely, and not everyone comes with the full portfolio of experience. If the core capabilities are there, and there are areas that are coachable, and a board should plan on investing in that just right across the board. I think it's essential, and I've been involved in a couple of searches lately as a member of a search committee or kind of shadow advisor, and the questions have come up. This person, has worked with this size budget, but they'd be moving to this size budget. I don't know. Is it? And I fear that the question is often tied to perceptions of capability around race and class. And so I've always pushed back and challenged and said, well, what's coachable? Is talent, does the person have talent, imagination, integrity, trust? Okay, so they've not worked with a big board of directors. That's coachable. Who on your board is going to work with them? And that seems to be the thing that gets people over the wobbliness. It's like, okay, build that infrastructure. Next. And there's not really much to come back from.
Well, and Jenny and I traded messages about a research report that just came out earlier this week from an organization called Building Movement Project. It's about glass ceilings and glass cliffs, and it looks specifically at the experience of nonprofit organizations that have a leader of color following, a series of historically white CEOs. And so it talks about a lot of things that Jenny flagged in terms of investment in executive coaching and capacity building for the organization generally. And I would recommend, if this is a question that, Yvette, the question you asked, if that's a question that folks have, that they go to that report, because leaders of color, there is a whole set of data around how they're often, like women who are brought into organizations to lead, set up to fail because they don't have the slack that Rick was talking about earlier. So there is no belief in their potential to bridge that gap from a $1 million budget to a $5 million budget. There is no patience for perhaps a lack of sophistication in something that's new to them in the job. And so it's important for organizations who are transitioning from a white leader to a leader of color to be conscious of what's outlined in this report and to invest funding and coaching, and not just for that individual, but coaching and capacity building for the organization through a transition. Heather McGee, who was the CEO of Demos at one point, actually fundraised for her transition into the CEO role before she assumed it, and has talked about how critical that was to her success in the role.
Wow. So let me pull in some questions here from the audience. And again, thank you everyone for sending in your questions. This is a really great conversation, and I feel like there's so many tangents we can go off on. But I think one of the important things that I'm hearing here. So when you are centering others and bringing other voices of different levels of power, experience, etc., like how do you delineate when to allow someone's voice to be heard? Is it always, sometimes, or is every voice important? How do you kind of prioritize this and know when, if when is even a question? Who'd like to take that one?
I feel badly about the word allow.
I know. Or I guess this comes to maybe thinking about it when you are the person that's holding the power. I could see like that place of fear that traditionally, just to say it, white male leadership may not necessarily know how to, share that power, or maybe you can get into a position where you're bringing too many people in, and like at some point you got to make a decision. At some point somebody's got to take and steer the ship. Like, I don't know if that's ever been an issue.
This is a tough question because it depends. So what are you talking about? Are you talking about, does every voice matter in terms of building a race equity culture at your organization? Or does every voice matter in that I have to negotiate the collective bargaining agreement? Or I've got to find a contractor to help us build the new hall. It depends. Within an organization, if you were trying to build a culture that centers the humanity of all individuals equally, and it has a race equity culture or an equity culture in an intersectional context, yes, all voices matter because every human matters equally. That doesn't mean that if you work in finance and we are deciding who's going to headline the gala or designing the program for the season, who's going to open the season, you're not involved in that. in that, except maybe in terms of the generation of ticket sales. How many butts are we going to get in the seat? But not every voice is relevant to every decision. And yes, every voice is important in that their humanity should be validated and valued within the context of an organization's culture. And to your point, Yvette, there are some people who are going to demand that their voice be heard by virtue of their privilege. And so you need to be conscious of power and how it operates, and privilege and how it operates when you listen as a leader to who is speaking up and who is not speaking up in the room, and to whose idea is elevated once it's out there and whose is ignored. So there's a lot of nuance to that question. It would be easier to answer if there were a particular example, or child, like we knew what the exactly what the challenge is. But if you're building an organizational culture that centers equity, yes, you need to send the message to your staff that every voice does matter, and then provide some clear guardrails around how voices within the organization are valued and heard, and how feedback is acted upon. Do you have a feedback culture? How is feedback given and received? How is it acted upon? Does it not matter? So there's a lot in there.
I actually have a question tied to this, because I do think if I focus the question, especially on EDI strategies, there could be a little bit of a analysis paralysis, or like a feedback paralysis, where you're getting so much input, or you incorporate so many voices, and or even throwing that responsibility on the staff of an organization to kind of figure this out by informing this plan. Having been having had that experience myself, and felt the frustration of it not moving forward, and feeling like at some point leadership does need to take the reins and move it forward in a way that those in middle management or support staff can't, or weren't at least empowered to make those decisions. Like, do you want to speak to this? Because I do think this came up quite a bit, like in this movement of everybody having a statement or something very visible for the external, relations part of this, but internally, like trying to do the right thing and incorporating too many voices, kind of stalling the work and stalling the action.
Yeah, I think your point is right on, and everything that Kerrien said, I just want to put an exclamation point. It's my experience exactly. I think though, what I'm trying to do, at least in my role, as we really move forward, focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is to hear as many voices as we can, to learn from folks, and then do two things with that. One is we have to focus. This can be overwhelming. Just the classic boil the ocean or eat the whole elephant, or whatever that expression is. It can be overwhelming. Where do you start? What do you do? Right. And so what I've tried to do is really starting with our vision, and starting with where we see ourselves, what we want to become, what are the best strategies to get us there, and let's agree and focus on that, not to the diminishing of other things that are important that other departments might be doing. But I think we really have to make sure everybody knows what our key priorities are, because they are the things that are going to help us become what we say we want to become, and where we see ourselves going. So trying to focus our plan on a smaller set of objectives and strategies, and we'll revisit those, because at the end of the day, if they're not working, it's not about what you're doing, it's about what you're accomplishing. So at the end of the day, if those things that we think are the right things are not getting us where we want to go and accomplishing what we want to accomplish, then we need to revisit those. But I think you can do both. I think you can listen widely and broadly and have an inclusive process. But at the end of the day, to really make progress, you do have to kind of focus on those things that you believe will get you the furthest in terms of where you're trying to go and what you're trying to become. And it's a nuancing to try to do that in a way that doesn't shut out voices or cause people to feel like they really haven't been heard, because their suggestion may not be the one or the ones that you settled on.
I think we also have to try to nurture our way through away from a gotcha culture, and to really embrace this notion of assuming positive intent, because not everyone, either by experience or generational lived experience, is at the same place of awareness, within an organization. If you have people from different backgrounds, generations, perspectives, I subscribe to this notion of an ongoing conversation, because people will stumble, and they'll say they will be awkward. And if they feel welcome to express, to learn, to refine this sort of ideation process or rapid prototyping, whatever we want to call it, but people need a chance to learn, to fail, to improve, to be in a process. And one thing that I've been really frustrated with at times is that the gotcha culture that surrounds some of this actually inhibits progress. And it requires a level of self-discipline for us not to say, oh my God, I can't believe they didn't say that, you just said that, as opposed to taking a deep breath and asking questions and being in a dialogue that enables people to continue on. And I think that that's really important. I'm not sure that we've discussed that enough, is how, as much as we want to embed the anti-racist principles and practices and focus on internalizing and not just performing through, superficial learning, people are going to stumble. And how we deal with stumbling, it's not just, failure. Failure is too binary, success, failure, but stumbling and awkwardness and challenging ourselves and coming back to it every day. Like, a good relationship, you have disagreements, you come back, you listen, you do better, you internalize, it becomes stronger. That is super important too, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to just the vulnerability in this work for everyone on every side of this. So that's a really important point. We have a few more minutes here, and I think I'm taking a couple of questions and putting them together. And I don't know if maybe one of us or maybe quickly can add. I think what people would like to know is, how do you call in those who are disengaged? How do you center those, particularly youth? I think there's in the audience, lots of folks are wanting to engage youth, whether it's for the audience or whether it's in the work. Does anyone want to take that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in because it was connected to what I was thinking about saying about the last piece. And that is, in my experience, people get together and get involved when they're doing something. And I think that the young people very much feel that way. We do want to have a dialogue, but being brought in just to dialogue can sometimes, not be a motivating thing. I used to say, no kid wants to go to a anti-drug pregnancy prevention workshop, but they might want to do a play. And they might want to be part of a choir, and the learning and the coming together comes through action and doing the things that they care about and that they're passionate about. If you're asking them to come out because you have a need, but it doesn't at all address what their needs, what they want to do, what they want to get done, I think you're going to be fighting a losing battle. So my advice is, engage people in the things that they're passionate about, and they will come, and give them a platform and give them a real voice when they come. I remember they would invite, I'd go to conferences, and they'd always say, can you bring some kids from Mosaic? Because we want kids at this conference. And then we get to the table and they would dismiss whatever the kids said. So it's not enough to bring them in. You have to show that they have a stake and they have a role, and do the things that they care about. Otherwise, I think it's very hard to engage them.
Yeah, they're not show ponies.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Jenny, Kerrien, Harold. Thank you, Sphinx. Clearly, centering others, it makes a difference. And listen. Yeah. Participate. I just want to thank you again for your time. I'm so grateful to have shared this space with you, and thank you, audience, for engaging and for all the great questions. For those that we didn't get to, I hope we continue these at the next conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.